Joining us today for the National Alzheimer's and Dementia Resource Center webinar series. Today we're presenting the experience of younger onset Alzheimer's disease and the importance of community. The National Alzheimer's and Dementia Resource Center webinar series is supported by the Administration for Community Living. Before we start, Erin Long of the Administration for Community Living will provide a brief welcome. Erin?
Hi, everybody. I just wanted to say thank you so much for taking time out of your busy day to join us for this webinar on such an important topic. I want to thank Susan Frick from the Rush Alzheimer's Disease Center and the two caregivers who agreed to share their wisdom with us today for taking the time out of their really busy schedules to join us and let us learn from them. So with that, thanks, and back to you, Sari.
Thank you so much, Erin. So as you heard, today's main presenter is Susan Frick. Susan has worked at the Rush Alzheimer's Disease Center since 1997, coordinating dementia-specific training programs, providing support for research participants and clinic patients, and coordinating the Dementia Friendly and Dementia Friends initiatives in Illinois. Ms. Frick is the director of Without Warning, a support group for individuals and families who live with younger onset Alzheimer's disease, and is the executive producer of the documentary created by the group entitled Too Soon to Forget: The Journey of Younger Onset Alzheimer's Disease. She is the presenter of the TEDx talk Loneliness and Alzheimer's Disease as well. Susan is joined today by two family members of people living with younger onset dementia who she will introduce. At this time, I will turn the floor over to Susan to begin. Susan?
Thank you so much. And thank you for inviting us. And thank you to everyone for your interest in this topic. I have been, as mentioned, a social worker at the Rush Alzheimer's Disease Center for 27 years. And for 20 of those years, we have offered this program called Without Warning. And this is our anniversary year of 20 years. And so what we're talking about today is really what we have learned from about both the experience of living with younger onset Alzheimer's disease and also the importance of creating community and creating support for the families who are living with this. And so we're basing a lot of our conversation on our support group. And I wanted to tell you a little bit about young onset Alzheimer's disease. I feel like when we first started working on this, there wasn't a lot of resources out there for people who were young. And we were seeing so many people in our clinic, being a specialty clinic and being one of the centers that's federally funded, we tend to get people who are experiencing Alzheimer's at a different age or more unusual cases. And so we were seeing a lot of people back in 2003 and 2004 who were young, and there weren't places to send them. And so that's how we really got started in this group. And as you probably know, young onset Alzheimer's disease is often thought about as being people under the age of 65. And then what's referred to as later onset Alzheimer's disease is over the age of 65. We don't really know exactly how many people there are with young onset Alzheimer's. There's thought that it's about 10% of those diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease are young, but that can also take in other forms of dementia. And so, it can be, we're not exactly sure how many within that 10% is young onset Alzheimer's disease. The majority of cases of people who are young do seem to be sporadic, where the family will say, no one else in our family has had it at this age. In some cases, there can be a familial aspect to it, where you see multiple cases of it throughout the family, and you start to see a pattern. And we have had a few cases like that in our support group over the years, but most families have been living with what would be referred to as just sporadic. Diagnosis for people who are young is often the similar steps, but can take longer, because when you're thinking of someone in their 40s, 50s, early 60s, we've even had a few people in their 30s. You're not thinking Alzheimer's disease. And so often families will be told that it's anxiety, that it's stress, depression. Women are often told that it's menopause, and it can take a bit to figure out that no, we're probably looking at an Alzheimer's disease. Now with SPECT scans and with lumbar puncture sometimes being done for a diagnosis, that can help speed up the process. But again, you have to get to a point where you're thinking to do that. And you've often ruled out other things. And also what we sure have seen is that the disease process might be similar to someone later in the disease, but you're at a different point in your life. You're at a point where you don't expect to be living with dementia and so it can have a huge impact on a person's financial situation and a huge impact on their family and then also relationships around them. And so you're probably going to hear about that from our two people today. We have, and we'll get to them after we go through some more topics, but we have Michelle and Katrina that are with us, both who are caring for their husbands right now. Michelle has her husband John, who was diagnosed in 2019 at the age of 59, and Katrina, her husband Michael, was diagnosed in 2016 at the age of 55. And so again, not an age where you would be expecting to deal with Alzheimer's disease. And so 20 years ago, or really 21, we started thinking about what should we do to help support the needs of these people who are living with this illness at such a young age. And back then, they often would lump together what they referred to as early onset and early stage. And they would be put together in a same support group, meaning people who were young would be put together with people who are older, but maybe early in the disease process. And they're at different points in their life. And so we had some people who had been diagnosed with Alzheimer's who kept calling us saying, this doesn't work for me. I need some other type of group. And we started Without Warning, and it's been going strong, changing over time, but going strong for the past 20 years. And we'll talk a bit more about that towards the end, because part of what then has been an outreach of this group is developing a website for people who are support group facilitators. And we want you to be aware of that resource is available, because not everyone's always trained to be able to run a support group who does. So that's been one of the outreach efforts of our support group. And how we structure the group. It has changed a little over time, but we are currently, since COVID, meeting online. We are having weekly care groups for the caregivers, and then we've been having monthly groups for the people with dementia. We've started up a bereavement group on that's meeting online, and then we are having, for those who are local, having a social gathering every month to be able to get people together. When we met in person, we were averaging anywhere from 50 to 80 people at a meeting, which for all you social workers out there is way too big for a group. But what we would do is break into 5 to 6 different groups at the same time. So we would have 2 groups for people with dementia, and then typically 3 or so groups for family members. And we would, and as you can imagine, running a group that size monthly took a lot of staff. And so we'd have myself, we'd have social work interns, nurse practitioners from our clinic, and then we had chaplains from the Rush Hospital who would come, and then a lot of volunteers. And it took a huge effort. Since COVID, we've been meeting online, and we're definitely smaller than we were, but our caregiver group has around 12 to 15 people per weekly meeting. What's been difficult is the group for people with dementia has been harder online. And I think that's one area we feel bad about in the change with COVID, because we used to be such a strong program for the person with dementia. And we're having to kind of readjust on that. But that has been our structure. You'll see on our website, you can structure groups in all different ways. This is how it's worked for us. To have such a large program, we did it because there just wasn't a lot of other things out there for people who were young. And so we wanted to be able to support those who were living with this. And so we found that when we started offering the program, there were so many more people in the greater Chicago area and even beyond, because we'd have people who would drive several hours to come to, like an hour and a half or so to come to the meeting from Wisconsin, Michigan, Southern Illinois, Central Illinois, because there wasn't other things. And so being online, we've been able to reach people around the country, which has been nice too. So let's think a little bit, and then we'll hear from our panel in just a bit. We kind of want to look at it from what is the experience for the person with dementia and what is the experience for the family member. And you'll see some paintings or artwork in this. We had a person who helped facilitate groups who was also an artist and a chaplain. And she drew artwork based on the conversations from our group. So we have about 5, 6 drawings that are now paintings from our group that help to explain what was the conversation in the groups. But often for the person, there's what we see is varying levels of awareness at the beginning. Often some people will say they start to notice a change. Some it's the family start to notice the change more, but often changes in memory and communication and daily activities, changes in mood and personality, and also then their roles and relationships. And we sure have found in particular for people who are young that often spouses will think that something is happening to their marriage, maybe before they start to think about Alzheimer's disease, because they think the person's just not quite relating in the same way and isn't able to, doesn't seem as engaged in the same way that they used to be able to be. And this piece of art was created because a gentleman in a group I was running said that to him, Alzheimer's disease felt like he had fallen into this pit and he could see everybody outside of the pit, but he couldn't figure out how to get back to them. And then Shauna, who is our artist, you'll notice in a lot of the paintings, she would use the words that were talked about in the group to add into the art. So they've been very interesting conversation pieces that we've used throughout the years with the group. And what are the challenges for the person when this all gets started is often the diagnosis can take some time. And, the person might be saying, I just don't feel right. I don't feel like I'm the same. I don't feel like I had one person say to me who had Alzheimer's, she said she felt like she had lost her autopilot, that all the things she used to be able to do without thinking about it now became really difficult. And she felt like she was missing and she was missing things a lot. Something that's very different for young onset is how they leave work. There's often, and this we've seen the whole gamut. We've seen people who the work environment rallies around them and gives them kind of a send-off. We've also had people who were escorted out the front door of the building and had terrible work performance reviews because they didn't know what was going on. And so there's often the way they leave work, they feel different about it than maybe someone who retires and plans for retirement. I used to use the word retirement, and I had a person say, this isn't retirement. I left in a way that I didn't plan. And then it's so much tricky finding what is their purpose and what is their role now that they're living with Alzheimer's disease. So Katrina and Michelle, if you guys could both unmute. And Michelle, maybe we'll start with you. What do you think your husband was experiencing? And John was a school teacher, taught Jim. What was happening for him early in this process? And what do you think he was noticing during this process?
He was noticing that he couldn't do things, but he is and was an extremely positive person. So he was just continuously trying to do workarounds. He couldn't figure out how to set the alarm. So he would just wake himself up every hour until school started. I had no idea. And so he was just positive and trying to do workarounds. And I'm sure there was fear and some denial mixed in with that. But he was very shocked when the school asked him to go to a doctor to see if there was something wrong. And then he was able to retire and forced to retire at the same time. So,
Yeah, yeah. So they were really noticing things before you, the school, before
yeah,
you were really seeing things happening.
I had him go to counseling because
So
I'm
you were
like, you're not communicating. He was forgetting how to play games, but it was things that he never did, and he didn't do well, and he was doing worse at them. So,
yeah.
but no, they noticed a big change. And I say we were in the middle of raising teenagers.
Yeah.
I was going to cheer practice. He was staying home and doing, yeah, I mean, he was coaching. So we weren't, we were just at opposite
Right.
ends anyway.
Right. And I think that's one thing that's so unusual with young onset. You're still in the midst of a very busy life, which for someone who's older, their lives are starting to slow, often can be slowing a little bit, or at least not in full work mode. That often happens. Katrina, you and Michael were running a daycare program. What were you noticing, or did you notice problems with him at the very beginning?
I think it took me a little longer to, like Michelle, to really hone in on things specifically. There'd be little things, but he was never good at remembering people's names. So we just kind of brushed that off. It was just getting worse. He was one that he would lose his keys ever so often, but all of a sudden he was losing things and not being able to find them. I think one of the bigger things that started happening was his inability to find his way to destinations he was familiar with. Like all of a sudden he'd be like, oh, what's going on? I totally forgot how to get to so-and-so. And like Michelle, I think there were the staff at the daycare. I did the paperwork from home, and he was pretty much the daycare person, in-person person. And I think they noticed things that they just kind of brushed off or, dismissed as well. He overcompensated as well for different things. He just kind of brushed it off. Oh, I'm just stressed. That's why I didn't remember this. I was also his memory. I did a whole lot of things that he didn't have to do. He didn't have to remember. So some things were very hard to remember. Or to realize that he had an issue with.
Do you think you became his memory, or was that something you had always done for him?
In some areas, like appointments, things like that, he didn't have to remember. He wasn't the type of person that wrote things down or kept a calendar.
So you just sort of did that.
Yeah, and that made it really hard. I always joke that if it were me, you would know right away. But for him, it was a little harder because he just kind of, got up and did his thing during the course of the day. He didn't have a routine, not really. He could change his plans. Someone could call him. He could change his plans at the spur of a moment. Oh, well, I forgot about so-and-so because this person called and asked me to help him with that. So it was really a little more difficult with him because of just how he functioned normally.
For either one of you, how do you feel it was being told it was Alzheimer's disease? How do you think that was for your husbands?
For John, he's never outwardly known, accepted, admitted. He cried. We went to Mayo's and for the final diagnosis and got a PET scan. He cried for a minute or two, and then nothing since. And he just, I tell him sometimes he gets frustrated. Well, you have a brain disease, and he'll go, "Oh yeah," but so he's just never outwardly dealt with it.
Yeah, Katrina, how was it for Michael?
Initially, I was the one that pushed to go see the doctor. So we spent a good period of time just getting his diagnosis. By the time we got it, I think he realized for sure something was going on. And once they said it, I was relieved just to know it was something and it, and specifically what it was. But for him, he just was kind of like, okay. But later I found out from some of his close friends that once he did tell them, he had a hard time telling people. When he did tell them, he was very emotional.
So he did take it in. And yeah, okay. And I have heard, like what you said for you, Katrina, of almost, I don't know if you use the word relieved, but I think in some cases, people are like thankful that they know what it is,
Yeah.
not thankful for what they're living with. But I had one gentleman who had Alzheimer's disease, and he said that he was actually very thankful to finally have the diagnosis. And he said, because it explained me. And I thought that was so interesting of, he was like, now I understand why I'm having all these troubles and why I'm acting the way that I'm acting,
Yeah.
which I thought was interesting.
And
Yeah.
it's not a response, but for me, it was like, okay, now I can go forward with where we need to go from here and know what's going on.
Okay. So for you, it kind of gave some like framework of like,
Yes.
all right, now I know where we're at. Probably
Yes.
not, again, wanting to be in that framework, but
Right.
knowing,
At least
yeah.
I know what it is. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you. We're going to switch and talk a bit about now, which we already have broached on for sure, but the caregiver experience. This was a painting that was drawn because we had a conversation once with a group of caregivers where they talked about that their social circles kept getting smaller and smaller until it was just them and the person with Alzheimer's disease. And then Shauna added all the word, not all, but a good number of the words that were talked about in that group session. And you can see grief, abandonment, they're not easy words to think about. And I think for family members, that image of the world getting smaller is so true, because their life becomes very much figuring out how to handle day-to-day tasks. I am always so amazed in our caregiver group, which we'll have tomorrow morning, of the conversations that occur that there's so much that they have to think about as caregivers, from very detailed little things of like, how do I get them to take this pill? How do I get them into the bathroom? How do I make sure their mood's okay? How do I stay okay? Like just the amount that they're thinking about is a lot. And having to figure all that out. And so, as you already heard, recognizing the problem can be tough. And like you often hear, and people will say that once they were told it was Alzheimer's, then they can kind of think back and say, well, I think this has been coming on for a couple years, that it just doesn't happen within the few months of waiting to be seen and getting the diagnosis, that this is something that is slow and that often we write off to other things when we see these issues. And so that can take time to figure out, like Michelle talking about heading for counseling. That is such a common thing, in particular for people who are young, because they feel like something's going on here in our relationship, that it's just not the same. Adjusting to the stress, we sure see that there's sort of a wave to what happens for caregivers, as they're progressing with this. And kind of early on, it's almost the shock of, okay, what do I have to figure out? And the immensity of, thinking about all the steps that need to go into place, like legal planning, financial planning, which is so different for people who are young. And then just the grind of caregiving, of figuring out what I need to do when. Changes in communication. That is so hard. And that is a common talk within our groups of figuring out, what do I say when this happens? And what do I do? And I think another, which I'm sure we'll discuss in a bit, is figuring out how to balance safety and autonomy. I think figuring out when, as a caregiver, do you take over and do things for the person, and when do you let them do as much as they possibly can? I had one years ago, one woman in the group that I ran when we were meeting, which she had Alzheimer's, and because I was with that group, and then we had other people doing the family groups, and she was constantly losing her purse and setting it down and just not finding it. And so her husband's response to that was to take away the purse and just to not let her carry a purse anymore. And she was in my group just so upset about it. And she was saying, I just want my purse back. I want to have a purse. And so we had to kind of talk with the husband about, let her carry something. Maybe it doesn't have all the crucial things in it, which is probably a good idea, but have something. And I think it is that, I think from his perspective, he was kind of like, problem solved. She's not going to lose her purse anymore. But in her mind, it was an item that was taken away that was very crucial to her. And I think that is so hard, and there's no perfect answer on how to balance this. The same gentleman who talked about feeling like he fell into a pit, his name was Ted, and he had Alzheimer's. He one time said in group, and it always stuck with me, I was the only one sitting in the circle who didn't have Alzheimer's. Everybody else did. And he pointed to me and he said, you know, when you leave the stove on, people just laugh about it. When I leave the stove on, I'm told I can never touch it again. And I thought, you know, that is so true. We all get to make mistakes. I can't tell you how many times I haven't found my purse or my bag and have walked around the house looking for it. That scene is okay. Or I have left it. One time I did leave the stove on and I came down in the morning and the burner was on. And my first thought was, Ted would just be really laughing at me right now. You know, but I still use a stove. But someone like Ted would have been told he couldn't. And I think that balance there's no perfect answer to it. And I think that is one thing that families have to wrestle with constantly, of how do they figure this out and keep the person as independent as possible, but also safe. And that's not an easy balance. And so a couple other issues that come up with families, and this was a painting that was drawn based on conversations with children we were having when we were running a young children's group, and they were kids who were in elementary school up through high school, and they talked about how they felt like they were stagehands and having to do so much behind the scenes to keep their person with Alzheimer's center stage, which I thought was quite an interesting visual. And I've used that with professional caregivers a lot because I think they're doing the same thing. They're doing so much behind the scenes to keep the person with Alzheimer's center stage. Or the other phrase we use all the time is setting the person up to be successful, making sure, and I think family members do this all the time too, so that it's an interesting image. But for people who are young, the financial burden of losing an income when you're not expecting it, to have that stop, that sure can vary in impact from family to family. Figuring out how to handle everyday tasks, and that usually starts slow, where the person can still do some things for quite some time, sometimes, but then it starts to build on what needs to be handled. And then just the change of role within family, like Michelle talking about having kids that, you know, when this was happening, and also just extended family and extended community. And sometimes we see people, often I hear from families that they feel like extended family or extended community aren't always as supportive because they're not sure how to be supportive. And so that's one thing we tried to look at, is how to help kind of keep those people as engaged as possible. And so for both of you, you know, how would you say, for what has been some of the hardest caregiving moments? And I know you're at varying stages now. You both have been living with this for a few years, so not in the early stages anymore. But what would you say, and Katrina, maybe let's start with you, and then we'll go to you, Michelle. What would you say has been some of the hardest challenges as being a caregiver for Michael?
I thought about this. It's because, like it's a stage thing. But I'd say globally, the hardest part for me, Michael's ability to communicate was difficult early on. So his inability to tell me what's going on, or to express if he doesn't feel well or if he's sad, I have to watch him, literally, like constantly watch him, because he can't tell me. He can say certain words, and over a period of time, I've looked back on old videos I took just 2 years ago, and we could actually hold a conversation. It was odd conversations, but they were conversations nonetheless. But now I just can't communicate with him. So that has been difficult for me with regard to the changes in our responsibilities. because, and this is a good thing, because I did a lot of things, Michael was spoiled, basically. That's the easiest way I can explain it. So I did he didn't have to cook. I didn't have to worry about him turning the stove on or anything. He was turning on the stove. Maybe the microwave, but not the stove. Cleaning, those kinds of things were not as big of an adjustment. Major things, major decisions were, but again, it's funny how you just go with the flow. It's as things change and adjust, you just have to turn and make that flip the switch over and say, okay, I'm doing this now.
Right.
As far as he's concerned about those things, I think, and I feel very fortunate with this, he never gave me a hard time about it. I think he was aware that he couldn't do certain things, and he was just like, somebody has to help me. So I didn't have a lot of resistance in that.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. Michelle, for you, what would you say has been some of the hardest parts about being a caregiver for John?
Well, at the beginning, I laugh now. It was his positivity was really hard for me to handle because everything was okay. And no, everything was not okay. And that just, now he's leveled out, but that was just hard for me because there was just no understanding of, no, this is hard. Then I think later on it became his mood shifts and knowing when I needed to step in and have something medically work with that was difficult. Stepping into his personal area, like having to help him take a shower or help him with the bathroom, those kinds of personal things were very hard because that broke the barrier, that broke the wife-husband barrier. And so that was difficult for us to do. And just the day-to-day grind, I think, to just, you don't know how long the disease will last. So if I knew the disease was going to be 15 years, I would pace myself one way. And if I knew it's going to be a year, I would pace myself a different way.
Interesting.
So it's just, and I miss him. I just miss him.
Yeah. Yeah. And
and he misses him.
Yeah.
I mean, he's been able to say that recently with the change in medications. He's actually much more aware right now. And he's just, he's been able to say that he can't do what he used to be able to do. And he's a little bit more aware of that.
Yeah. Which is probably sad for both of you to see things like that and to hear comments like that. Michelle, how old were your kids when
my daughter had just turned 19 and she was going to go away to school when he came home and said the school basically said, you need to find some medical reason to retire or get it fixed. And then my son was 21 and he was away at school.
Which is not an age where a child is thinking they're going to be dealing with a parent with dementia.
No, it was very hard for them. And I made a decision early on, which I think John would agree with, that they just needed to live their lives as if their dad did not have dementia and go to college, start their careers, come home, interact with us just as if they, I was lucky I didn't need them to caretake for him. So that was a good thing. And he enjoys them. He has no idea who they are, but he enjoys when they come home and he enjoys when they interact with them.
Yeah.
So, it's been tougher on my son than my daughter. I don't know if that's a son-daughter thing, but they're working through it.
Yeah. Yeah. And we're going to move on to talk about the group. I feel like we could spend so much time discussing this. So I'm so glad you shared these insights because I feel like it's so helpful for professionals to hear what it's like to be a family member and hear what it's like to have been the person with dementia. And so just so you have this, for those of you listening to this, these are the common resources that families often look to, not in every case, but often they have to get some type of help. I know for Michelle, John's in daycare right now. For Katrina, Michael is on hospice, right? Not palliative care. So, you know, these resources are there, and I think it's helpful to know as professionals where you might need to be directing people to look. And so to spend our last few minutes talking about the importance of community. And this was an image that was created because a gentleman with Alzheimer's said, he was talking about our support group, and he said, I love coming here because we're all in the same boat together. And so Shauna, it's a little harder to see in the painting than in the sketch she first made, but Shauna created an image that showed a person by themselves in the boat where the waters are rougher and it's darker and it looks more stormy. And then on the side where people are kind of gathered together, the idea is the waters are getting calmer, that they're not perfect by any means, but they're getting calmer and that the sun is coming out. And I think what we sure have seen is this is a lonely illness. I've had over the 20 years so many people with Alzheimer's and so many family members use the same phrase and say they almost wish they were living with cancer as opposed to Alzheimer's disease, because people know how to talk about cancer and people don't know how to talk about Alzheimer's. And the first few times I heard it, I was surprised. Now I've just heard it. And I think that speaks to, as a community, we know kind of what to do when someone's living with cancer or another illness, and we rally around them and we drop off food and we create teams and go walk and walks. And for people with dementia and family members, this is a long, slow process. And I think it's hard for some people to know what to do. And so it's lonely for a lot of people. It's lonely for the person and it's lonely for the family around them. And so I think the more as professionals we can help develop support for them or encourage them to get involved in different ways. And the one in particular that we sure think about is support groups. Thinking about how do we create space where people can come together and share their story and be with each other. I often think back, one of the gentlemen that was in my group, Ted, who we filmed in our documentary, actually a week before he passed away, we filmed about the importance of community and hospice. And he was also a person who was an AA counselor, had an addiction issue years and years and years ago. And he sat in my group one time with Alzheimer's, seeing the other people with Alzheimer's. And I remember he just smiled and he said, it's only in a group like this where we're truly ourselves, when we're able to share. And, and he's coming from the AA tradition, but he was also saying, I can be in this space and share that I have dementia and everybody else gets it and knows what's going on. And that's the same for caregivers too, same for, the person, extended family, whatever type of group you want to create, it makes a space where the people feel an instant connection and feel that they are part of a community. And so there's different types of groups. We have created one that's ongoing, that is just based on the conversations they can tell you every week. We kind of start it with just like, so who would like to get us started? We don't have a set agenda. We don't have a set topic. We just roll from what people talk about. And it's so interesting because pretty much every week, whatever someone brings up, others relate to it and say, oh, I'm dealing with that too, or here's how that experience is for me. So I used to come, probably because of my own just nerves and building up my own confidence as a leader, I used to come with some materials. I used to come with some quotes from books. And if I felt like the conversation was lagging, I could use those items. I haven't had to use those in a long, long time. But you can have groups that are more educational in nature, where there's much more structure. Some support groups are peer led. AA is often like that, but also in the caregiving world, you could have a caregiver who's, it could be peer led. From my standpoint, we have staff in there. Then also social, cognitive, or physical type activities, memory, which often falls into what memory cafes are. Those are a support program within. It wasn't what we initially thought of when we developed our toolkit project, but they sure are being done by a lot of people. And then benefits. I think knowing that you're not alone. And what I've heard people say is it doesn't make the experience is still the same, and we're still, they're still living with Alzheimer's, but they have a place where they can bring their concerns and they can bring their joys or their stress. Our group, several of them have started what they call humor journals, and they write down, things that they find humorous or funny within the role of being a caregiver. And I think sometimes then realizing you're looking at your life from looking towards humor, they have conversations on that, or gratitude, or one person said, I mark down sometimes when someone tells me I'm doing a good job, because she said, I don't get to hear that very often, so I think there's all these benefits in pulling people together. And so for both you, the two of you, Michelle, we'll start with you this time. What would you say about being in a support group? And for both of them, they joined after COVID. So they joined the online version of our support group. So go ahead, Michelle. I'm sorry to.
No, that's okay. The support group has been awesome. I belong to two. I belong to one that's in person, and then I belong to the Zoom one. It's funny because I go there sometimes and I get a lot out of it, and sometimes I leave and I'm upset, and it's all just me processing my emotions. And it took me a while to realize that, but no, the support group, I think this process would be much, much harder without it. My father passed away from Alzheimer's, so I had my mom as support for a while, and that was a great support. And then she passed away, and then this support group, helped fill in some of that support gap.
That's great.
So, and I love how Susan runs it. So I just want to let you know that.
Thank you. Katrina, for you, what would you say? How was it for you joining? And I know, didn't you say there was a few years where you didn't join the group and then you joined? How was that?
I had actually heard about your group maybe 2 years before I actually joined, because I was trying really hard to stick with the group that I'd kind of gone with, because that's where my husband's doctors were, and they had a monthly support group. It was on a day. It just made it really difficult. And finally, one day I saw your name somewhere, and I was like, I've got to call her. And I felt crazy afterward, because it's like, why didn't I do this 2 years ago? Our first conversation, even before I joined the group, was just so encouraging. So I knew, I was like, okay, if my conversation with her was this good, this support group has probably got to be really good. And I can say for a fact that I would probably not have handled some of the milestones that we've made, the progression in Michael's condition, as well as I have without the support group. They've given me suggestions and encouragement. They have helped me through some things I just wondered about, thought it was just coming to me. So that visual of knowing that there's other people who are experiencing the same thing you are experiencing makes the world of difference. I can talk to my family, and I have certain close friends that I can talk about like the nitty-gritty things with, but they can only really listen because they don't really understand. We laugh through a lot of things, but the support group, anything you say, it could be something you would never think of saying to anyone else, toileting, just things that you would never talk about with just the general public. But they understand. And there's always someone who has an experience that'll help you. So it has made the world of difference for me.
Thank you. Thank you. Let me I know we're getting close. So let me tell you just a little bit about a website that we've put together, and you'll have more information on this, but we called it the Toolkit Project. And we've created, because kind of knowing that there's so many people running groups who really haven't, I come with a master's in social work. I had done a little bit of group work before starting up this program, but there's so many people who are just kind people, and they get picked to be the support group leader. And so this is a resource that's available to you. And kind of knowing, based on what you heard from Katrina and Michelle, of how important it is to have support groups. So, and what it does for the experience. So this is sort of a list of what is available on the website. We've created it so that there's, parts you can print off. We're going to add more video content to it that we have. So I'm going to get that back up on there, but it gives you ideas of how to structure, how to think about common themes, and gives you questions you might be able to use in running a group. And also there is within the Toolkit forum project, we have a forum section, which is not seen by the public. You have to ask to join. It hasn't been utilized a lot, but the idea of it is that it's a space where support group leaders could ask questions of each other and say, here's something I'm trying. Has anyone else done that? I'm hoping, and it might just be that that's not the greatest spot to ask those questions, but I'm hoping as it gets going, it can get utilized. We have getting close to 300 people from around the world actually who have joined the forum. So there's a lot of wealth of resource there to be able to ask questions. So I'm hoping as we haven't really marketed that we even have this website. So as it keeps going, I'm hoping maybe the forum will get utilized more, and we're not going to take it down yet, or we have no plans to, because I'm hoping it can be a resource for people. So I encourage everybody on this to take a look at it, check it out, see if it provides information that's supportive and helpful. And I think we are to the end, so I'll turn it back.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Susan, Michelle, and Katrina, for your insight and wisdom. We really appreciate all three of you being here, especially Michelle and Katrina taking time out of your caregiving day to share your time with us. We do have questions that have come in. Susan, if you don't mind going to the next slide.
Oh, sure, you bet.
Actually, yeah, you can scroll through your resources while people are.
These are, yes, these are just.
Go ahead.
Resources. There's a few resources that will be available when you see the PowerPoint. Do you want me to stop screen sharing?
You can go to the last slide.
There we go. Okay,
so we want to thank you all for attending today. We will get to the questions in just a minute. Just so you know, the Administration for Community Living does have grant projects that they award at different times during the year. It's the Alzheimer's Disease Programs Initiative. And if you are interested and are at an organization that may be the right kind of organization to have one of these projects, please check out the www.grants.gov for more information. And if you need more information from those of us at the Resource Center who organize the webinars, the email address is on your screen as well. A few people have asked for the web address for the toolkit. Susan, if you want to go back to that slide while
sure.
I'll to the next question, or to the first question. So someone has asked, when you're working with people in the Without Warning support group and otherwise people with younger onset dementia, do you know if there's a certain proportion of people who are married versus those who are not? But more importantly, are there differences in the social and emotional support that you see provided for the person living with dementia? How is their experience maybe different for those who have caregiving spouses and those who do not?
So I would say the majority of people, and it's hard to know exactly if who is in our group represents the people living with young onset in the general public. Most of our people in our group have spouses. Some that I've dealt with throughout the years did not, say it was a divorced person or someone who was just single. And in some cases, it's the adult children being the caregiver for them, which is at a time when they didn't expect it. Or sometimes we've even had parents who have been caring for their child. So parents who are in their maybe 70s and 80s caring for their adult child with young onset. So it can vary, because we just don't exactly know how many people have young onset and the breakdown. It's often common that there's more women than men when we're referring to people who are older, because often women live longer than men. In our group, it's kind of hit or miss. I think in our group, what is often the catalyst for getting someone into the group is who is the caregiver and do they seek out support? And that usually drives the people to our group. So it's hard to tell. For the person with dementia, how we used to structure it when we met in person was we would have two groups, one where it was very much like a support group, verbal, knowing that they'd have some communication issues. Then we also had a music therapy group. And we had some people who would attend the music therapy group just because they liked music better. Sometimes it was because they were farther along and not able to communicate as well. But it was often what I'd hear from the person with dementia is kind of like Michelle saying about your husband missing who he was. It's often that loss of who they were and what are they now, like figuring out what their role is now is, especially since they work usually ends abruptly and then they have to figure out their self-esteem is just often a big blow for that. And figuring out how they fit into the family. Because I've had people, I had one woman say, nobody talks to me now. They talk to my husband, but they don't talk to me. And then when they'll go to talk, she said they kind of look over her. So I think that feeling kind of ignored. I had one woman say, I feel like I'm put into the corner. And she was from an incredibly supportive family. So her family would have been devastated that that's how she felt. But I think it's just part of the disease to feel that way too. What I've often heard about people who are younger is you're talking about people who are very healthy in a lot of ways, not an older person who might have a lot of other conditions going on. And so in a lot of cases, this might be the main and only thing they're dealing with is the Alzheimer's disease because they're healthy people because they're younger, which is hard, makes it very hard too, because they don't look like someone who would have dementia.
Right. Great, thank you. So I did put in the chat, I'm having intermittent freezing. So if you don't hear me after you finish a question, I'm popping them into the chat so you can see the next one. The next person was asking, can you give some guidance if you're working with someone you suspect there may be some younger onset dementia occurring? The person worked with someone who seemed to be struggling with their memory and they became upset when and argued when the person raised it with them, and everyone in the office noticed, but it was not addressed in a way that they had hoped. So
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. It's often hard because I think as employees or coworkers, you're not expecting to be working with someone that you start to worry about their memory. I think, I think HR has to know how to respond to this. I don't know if Michelle or Katrina in your cases, like Michelle, did the school reach out to you at all and tell you they were feeling like
Yeah.
there was a problem, or did you hear about it after he was let go?
I don't think the school handled it very well.
I know, that's often.
No, he drove home himself after suddenly being in a meeting and just told that, his performance was lacking, and he doesn't even remember the how it went. He couldn't let me know. But his coworkers had gone to the principal and then higher up with their concerns, and then they had a meeting, which I thought was fine. Or how else are you going to do it? And it was over a period of time.
It's often, you're right. It's often such a tricky issue because, and I appreciate the question for whoever wrote that, because I think probably your initial response is you should talk to the person themselves, but their ability to take it in might vary. And so then it's hard to know, what's the next steps? If you talk to people around, I've had and often I've seen sometimes where coworkers start kind of filling in for the person, especially if it's a person who's really beloved within the organization, to try to make it as smooth as possible. Katrina, in your case, this was a daycare that you owned, right? Like, did the employees come to you at all, or did they?
Not like you would think.
Yeah.
I would have preferred, like Michelle, I would have preferred that they would have come to me and said, Mr. Miller's been having a hard time with this, that, and the other. But what they would do is if he forgot something that was really important, they called me, oh, Mr. Miller forgot this. Can you
Aw.
order such and such, or can you call this person? So I was taking up the slack, and it took a little while even for me to realize, wait a minute, I've been doing a lot of this for,
Yeah.
but they never, until he was diagnosed, and I had to tell them because it was just hard for him. They were just like, oh, well, that explains this. And then they started telling me all these things. I was like, why didn't you tell me sooner?
You know, I think it's such a hard, and that's why I think how the question came, it's such a hard thing to know how to talk about. What we often say to families when they come to our clinic or in the group too, if the person is still working, it's almost an easier transition to leave work with a diagnosis as opposed to not having the diagnosis, because sometimes you lose access to benefits that you might be able to access if you know what's happening. But not everybody has a diagnosis before they leave work, so it's tricky. And so to whoever asked the question, there's no easy way to do it. I think it's approaching it with the person, but then also maybe talking to the staff around and then figuring out if you have to talk, if you're able to talk with family, if that's an okay process.
So we are just about out of time, so I'll have share one more question, and then we will close out. Can you talk a little bit about, does end of life discussion ever enter into your support groups or other conversations you're having with people who have younger onset?
Yes, it sure does. You know, encouraging people to get connected to palliative care or to hospice is, I think, really important. Also talking about, in our group, we've had our group right now, we used to break it up when we met in person, where families were kind of put into groups based on where they were in the process, so early, middle, late. Now we're all together, which has pluses and minuses, but we have a lot of discussion about what are common things that come about towards the end of the illness. How do you want to handle it? How do you, and I have several family, and then we still have family members who continue to come even though their loved one has passed away. And they are resources to the families living with it. And they talk a lot about, I have one that she is a huge advocate for hospice and getting people onto hospice. And I think for a lot of families, that's a scary thought to do that, and thinking that means death is just around the corner, but to realize what a support it can be, and to help the person stay at home and to be in a process that maybe is easier. So yes, we have a lot of conversation about end of life. In particular, I would say more with the caregivers than I did with the persons with dementia when we used to have the same group, both groups.
Wonderful, thank you. Well, we are just about out of time. We have voiced our thank yous, but we will do so again. We are so thankful for your participation today, everyone, and for a wonderful session. For the participants who have asked, we will be sending out the slides probably in a few days, so sit tight. I've sent out as many links as I can through the question and answer pod, and you can always reach us at NADRC-webinars@rti.org. Please plan on joining us for our next webinar on October 16th, where we will shift gears and talk about choosing, implementing, and evaluating dementia programs, knowing the key factors. We will send out information about that webinar via email, and we sure hope you will join us. And that's all for today. Thank you, everyone, and have a wonderful afternoon. Take care.